When war broke out in February between Iran, Israel, and the United States, many hoped that the conflict would deal a blow to Moscow's geopolitical influence. Iran, the country that gave Russia its first modern attack drones, was now under heavy bombardment itself, and wouldn't be of much use as a military or diplomatic ally for the foreseeable future. So on the surface, this new war seemed like a net negative for Moscow. But as days turn to weeks, it's becoming clear that Russia may actually emerge as one of the main beneficiaries of the new war in the Middle East. Why? Oil. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and this week we're going to take a look at how disrupted supply chains and soaring prices have catapulted Russia back to its status as a top oil exporter, with even Ukraine's allies rolling back sanctions on Russian oil in an attempt to fill the gap left by the now embattled Gulf states. Here in Ukraine, people are worried. Could this boost give Russia enough funds to keep waging war for years to come? Now, the first thing you need to know is that oil is a very volatile market. Every industrialized country needs a constant supply of oil, but not every country has oil fields to drill. Among those that have their own, there's competition to be the primary exporter to those that don't. When a country that exports oil is pushed off the market, whether due to sanctions or a disrupted supply chain, other oil-producing countries jump to fill the gap and reap the financial reward. And this means that the market can get shaken up basically overnight by a war or other major event, and an exporter's status can be turned upside down pretty unpredictably. But let's back up a bit and talk about what oil means specifically to Russia. It's hard to overstate just how much of 21st century Russia is built on oil and gas money. They have the 8th largest oil reserve in the world, they don't have a lot of other industries to export from when compared to other superpowers like China, and I'm not kidding when I say that almost all flashy Russian institutions are sponsored by state-owned oil and gas companies. There were zoning restrictions in St. Petersburg for centuries that said nothing could be built taller than the city's churches, but they made an exception for the Gazprom Tower, which is 3 times the height of the tallest cathedral where the Romanov family is buried. Now, I'm telling you this to illustrate that for Russians, oil is both the lifeblood of the economy and a point of national pride that supersedes even religion. When you go after the Russian oil industry, you go after the Russian economy, and Russia takes that very seriously. When Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, many countries reacted by swearing off or imposing sanctions on Russian resources. The sentiment was strong, but the results have been mixed. Even after years of sanctions and Western countries trying to move away from dependence on Russian resources, oil and gas have accounted for trillions of rubles in revenue to the Kremlin every year of its war. Some countries, including China, India, and Turkey, but also various nations in Europe, have continued to import Russian oil directly, while others have done so more underhandedly. Russia's used a network of inconspicuous shipping vessels flying foreign flags, known as the Shadow Fleet, to keep moving oil through waterways illegally throughout its invasion of Ukraine. But that's not to say that sanctions are completely ineffective. The Kremlin may still be collecting money on exports even while invading Ukraine, but its total oil and gas revenues fell 24% last year, to their lowest point since 2020. Countries that were still willing to buy oil from Russia paid significantly less than they otherwise might for it, which further reduced profits. Sanctions can genuinely chip away at the Russian war machine, although not cleanly or immediately. The lack of immediate effect from sanctions is also why Ukraine has made a practice of targeting Russia's refineries with drones. It breaks down the supply chain before the oil's even ready to export. But the idea is the same. To get at Russia, you have to get at Russia's oil. One sanction imposed or refinery destroyed isn't enough to force Russia's hand at the negotiating table. But in combination and over time, they chip away at Russia's economy and security, to the point where Moscow might be forced to question whether sustaining its war is the best way forward. Here to tell us a bit more about the role that oil plays in Russia's economy and geopolitics is economist Tim Ash. So to start with, could you just briefly explain the role of oil in the Russian economy and how much of their war machine comes from oil money?
Russia is a commodity exporting country. I mean, typically oil and energy have accounted for something like 40% of exports and more or less the same in terms of budget receipts. But other commodities, metals, grain, I mean, they account for probably around another 40%. So it's a commodity driven economy. Oil is it drives Russia basically.
But I mean, kind of with this new war, there's a lot of speculation about the state of the Russian economy after, years of their own invasion. Some say that they're really on the brink. Others say that, it's more resilient of a market than expected. And as of early 2026, when this new war broke out, kind of like, where are we?
I think the reality is that we have to accept 4 years after the full-scale invasion. And remember, first imposition of sanctions were after Crimea, so in 2014. The Russian economy is still functioning. There's a lot of resilience there. And there's resilience because I describe it in two ways. One is the one person who knew the full-scale invasion was going to happen was Putin. He prepared for this. He built up resources, defenses. Russia had about 600 billion of foreign exchange reserves prior to the full-scale invasion. Russia deleveraged over the last decade. I always called it Fortress Russia economic policy settings. They ran very cautious policy, tight fiscal, tight monetary. I think because Putin knew he was going to do this, right, to reduce vulnerabilities to sanctions and all those kind of things. And the second thing is, we've not done enough in terms of sanctions. We've not been clever enough. We've been too slow, too predictable. We've allowed the Russians lots of ways to get around it. Secondary sanctions have been very weak. No one's gone to jail for breaking sanctions. It's paid to help Russia to break sanctions. So that's the second point. Now, all that said, there's a lot to suggest that some of those buffers had begun to be eroded away late 25 and into 26. I think Trump's sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft had begun to make a difference. So you could see in, just last month, February, you look at the data, energy imports had dropped really significantly and energy production had dropped very significantly. Urals blend, the Russian main oil blend, was trading at a really substantial discount to WTI and Brent. So Russia was getting a lot less for its energy. It was exporting a lot less. The Indians, who had been buying a lot of Russian oil, taking advantage of, I guess, the weak sanctions regime anyway, because of the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, had actually stopped doing it. So Russia was struggling to export and sell its products. There's a lot of Russian oil floating around in tankers globally. Maybe some of the secondary sanctions had begun to take more effect. Some of the pressures on shadow fleet vessels, the French, the Belgians, other people sending helicopters and landing on shadow tanker vessels and impounding them, kind of taking them to port and questioning them, all those kind of things. A lot of that has, and I think, begun to weigh on Russian export receipts. And I think if you look at the data flow, we've seen that, the growth numbers, the January Russia reported a significant drop in real GDP. Inflation was high. Central bank policy rates were high in response. Fiscal deficit was growing. Things were becoming more difficult. And, Russia can always get through that by, the guns and butter scenario, basically diverting resources away from consumption to defense. And, things get more difficult for a lot of the Russian population, but Putin doesn't care. He can use repression. It's an authoritarian regime. There's been a lot of pain. If you look at the Russian media, a lot of people complaining about the poor state of the economy. And non-military sectors, construction doing very badly, companies going out of business, bad debts, rising non-performing loan in the banks. I mean, things getting more difficult, but I wouldn't say on the point of collapse.
Before we move on, I'd like to take just a moment of your time to bring your attention to something very serious and very close to the Kyiv Independent's heart. We're currently fundraising for the recovery of 25-year-old Ukrainian photojournalist George Ivanchenko, who lost his leg in a Russian drone attack while reporting from the front lines. George previously worked for us as a freelancer, and his injury comes as drones are making the front line more dangerous for reporters. We are raising $63,000 for the electronic knee module that George needs to get back his full mobility. Many have already donated, bringing George that much closer to getting back to reporting. We've set up our own fundraising platform that you can donate to securely from anywhere. There will be a link to it in the description below. As I explained, the oil market can be shaken up by a single unpredicted event, and the first months of this year have been full of unpredicted events. The US, the 10th largest producer of oil, has invaded 2 of the top 3 producers in the world so far this year. Venezuela is number 1, and Iran is number 3. If the year started with a relatively stable oil market, and more concerns about oversupply than shortages, that's categorically not the case just a few months later, as the price of oil surges. At this moment, travel in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping waterways in the world, is disrupted due to Iranian attacks on tankers and infrastructure. This means both that current stores of oil in the Gulf are unable to leave, and that buyers aren't placing bets on the channel to be open anytime soon. After the war kicked off on February 28th, crude oil went up to almost $120 a barrel at the beginning of last week, before stabilizing in the high $80 range midweek. And if you're like me, you probably don't have a great idea of what a barrel of oil goes for on any given day, but in their 2026 budget, Moscow set the baseline for a barrel of Urals crude at $59 per barrel. Now that means that if the market has stabilized somewhere in the 80-something per barrel range, Russia is making between $20 and $30 more per barrel than they planned, which adds up to quite a lot of money over millions of barrels. Analysts estimate that around 15 million less barrels of oil are leaving the Gulf states per day than before the conflict started. And the longer it lasts, the more likely it is that that $80 per barrel range could move back up to even the $150 range. And this means Russia, now a much more reliable seeming option to buy from, stands to earn over 100% more per barrel of oil than it budgeted for. And that will pay for a lot of drones, a lot of bullets, a lot of weapons that will kill Ukrainians. There's a direct relationship between the price of oil per barrel and the amount of months Russia can continue to fight. And there's another element that matters for Ukraine. It's not just that Russia is strengthened, but also that Western allies are and will continue to be weakened. Countries that previously relied on imports from the Middle East are paying those new prices per barrel while facing domestic inflation, economic hardship, and all of the accompanying distress from their citizens. The market change that grinds down Western economies will boost Russia's, and Ukraine is bracing for its allies to turn inward towards their domestic problems in the coming months. Now, let me linger for a moment on those last few words, in the coming months, because I'm using it mainly as a figure of speech to mean in the near, semi-foreseeable future. But that lack of preciseness touches on a complicated element of this story that I struggled with while writing this script. Because all of these moving pieces, the price per barrel, the sanctions, have wildly different implications for Ukraine if the war in the Middle East lasts days versus months versus years, and we're getting bipolar predictions on that front from even officials of the same countries. Starting last week, US officials began floating the idea of easing sanctions on Russian oil, a day after Washington issued a 30-day waiver allowing Russian crude oil, stranded at sea, to continue sailing to India. Now this comes after months of the US pressuring India to wean itself from Russian oil or be sanctioned, so the decision by the US marked a sharp about turn. US President Trump argues that America has to reverse sanctions on Russia until the strait is up, because he's ever a New Yorker in his phrasing, but he also said that the conflict is almost over. His exact words were actually, "It's very complete." Now, on the other hand, his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who one would think would be on the same page as his president, told reporters on Wednesday that America has just begun to hunt. In a move that everyone here in Ukraine found bitterly ironic, the US even referred to the conflict as a special military operation. We all know that those can go on indefinitely. But from the point of realism, Ukraine knows that a Trump deadline should be taken with a grain of salt. We're likely looking at a minimum of months, not weeks, before there's peace in the Middle East. Ukrainians don't share Trump's confidence that removing sanctions on Russia will just be some temporary measure to smooth things out. It has the potential to become a long-term savior of the Russian war machine. The diplomatic contradiction here is obvious. For months, Trump has insisted that he wants to end Russia's war against Ukraine, and sanctions are obviously one of the key tools at his disposal to pressure Moscow into peace. And as I said, sanctions aren't toothless. They can chip away at the foundation of Russia's war machine, and experts and allies alike have begged Trump over the months to act decisively. But even at his most aggressive, Trump's attitude towards Russia sanctions has been inconsistent, and the sporadic rollout has exposed his hesitance. And now the scant pressure that's been created is erased. Russia's getting the message that sanctions will be upheld until the moment they become inconvenient to uphold, which ignores the fact that sanctions should, by their very nature, be inconvenient. So how do everyday Ukrainians feel about the idea of America undoing the progress it's made in peace talks? We decided to find out.
Старий світовий порядок і безпекова система абсолютно рухнула, тобто вона і так тріщала по всіх швах, але зараз вона просто рухнула, то і хто Трамп це зробив, в принципі, і всі такі чітко просто дивляться в сторону. Не знаю, куди це приведе. Якщо ми беремо тільки санкції, то тільки зараз, а вже ж це, їм тільки в плюс, Путін в виграші, абсолютно. Тут ні про що говорити, більше грошей, більше можливостей бомбити нас і фінансувати війну проти України.
Я вважаю, що давно потрібно Америці і Трампу зосередитись або на допомозі України, або відверто сказати, що він на боці Росії. І все. Те, що це однозначно впливає на економічні процеси в світі, це 100%, але я як житель і мешканець нашої країни переймаюся в першу чергу за Україну. І мені хотілося б, щоб допомагали в першу чергу нам санкціями, зброєю чи будь-якими іншими способами байдуже.
Зараз за рахунок того, що на Сході розвивається дуже сильна війна, як і Іран, і Ізраїль, вони дуже сильно, і це відволікає увагу від України, і нам перестають давати поставки. І ще цей Трамп робить просто неможливі речі. Я просто розумію, що Трамп путініст, і для нас це погано. Що я можу сказати? Але ми переможемо.
Санкції зняти з Росії – це погано. Це дуже погано. Тому що ці гроші будуть йти на вооруження Росії. І це нам дуже недобре. Це життя наших українських захисників і захисниць.
Треба бути на стороні демократії і миру, а не на стороні диктаторів, такі як Хамені, такі як Путін кровавий. Тому треба бути з Європою і з Україною, а не з диктаторами. Ким Чен Ыном, которые хотят захопить мир и установить везде диктатуру на всей планете. Это не пойдет, это нехорошо. Нельзя снимать санкции.
The Kyiv Independent doesn't have its own oil fields to drill. We rely on our community instead. Every month, more than 25,000 people around the world help fund our frontline reporting, newsletters, war crimes investigation, and shows just like this for as little as $5. If you'd like to join our community, while also getting some cool perks to let you engage more closely with our work, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is so appreciated. So what happens with the sanctions rolled back? Now, there are two main outcomes that we can unpack. First is the less likely option. The war in the Middle East fizzles out quickly and oil prices return to more or less how they were a month ago. This would be the best possible scenario for Ukraine and its allies. Russia would have made a profit and could sit smugly with the new precedent around sanctions, but it would fail to get a long-term boost to its war machine. Now, the alternative scenario, where the war in the Middle East goes on for quite a while. Long-term war in the Gulf would shift the market further and further from the Strait of Hormuz, and make more and more countries dependent on alternatives like Russia. Ukraine is not getting an equal injection of money in year 5 of war, and nor are its allies. The longer the war in the Middle East continues, the wider that gap is going to become. But then kind of what's the worst case scenario if the restrictions are lifted? I know day by day we kind of get a new headline about this sort of what is the ceiling for Russia if these sanctions are gone, the war in Iran continues?
Well, I mean, it's very unfortunate, right? I mean, just when the sanctions were beginning to work, the Trump administration that has basically done nothing really to support Ukraine, for whatever reason, came out with the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. Just as they were beginning to work, Trump decides to invade Iran, and it's pretty catastrophic in terms of its impact on the global economy, probably, but also, it gives Putin another lifeline. It will make Putin think that he can, refill the coffers, has more money to rebuild the military-industrial complex, to wage war on Ukraine. You feel he can last the war longer than Ukraine, than Europe. It makes, a peace in Ukraine less likely, right? I mean, a peace process kind of less likely. There's also the angle that, at the back of my mind certainly is this Trump administration has shown a remarkable reluctance to hold Russia to account for anything. I mean, just imagine, this week we saw suggestions that Russian intelligence was being used to help the Iranians target American soldiers, and yet the Trump administration did nothing to sanction Russia because of it, but actually eased sanctions, rewarded Russia for bad behavior. So I have this sneaky feeling at the back of my mind that in the end, Trump wants to go back to business as normal with Russia. He wants big business deals, for whatever reason. They want to make money again from the relationship with Russia. You see more opportunity in business with Russia than business with Ukraine. So, and the question will be, when this war ends with Iran, will the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil be put back in place? I doubt it.
In many ways, it feels like the war in Iran has brought Ukraine back to square one. What little leverage had been created against Russia in the first year of US-led peace talks is being dismantled in a matter of weeks. For Ukraine, this will likely mean more of the exhausting cycle we've been in for the last year, while paying with many more lives just to hold the line. As long as Russia is growing and thriving while waging war, real peace will remain as elusive as ever. For our reader question this week, how will the oil prices affect Chinese-Russian relations? From what I understand, China already has a deal for cheap oil from Russia, so in theory, high prices would strain that relationship, as Russia would want the higher prices and China would not.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated relationship. The war in Ukraine ultimately made Russia more dependent on China. If you remember the Beijing Olympics, Winter Olympics, just prior to the full-scale invasion, there were tensions between the two because Putin saw himself as an equal partner, and the Chinese kind of didn't give him a great meeting at that particular time. He was a bit offended by it. He invades, screws up in the war in Ukraine, and then becomes much more dependent on China for economic support, provision of munitions and all those kind of things. And obviously there have been tensions between Russia and China. North Korean troops helping Russia in Ukraine again. That China likes to think that it dominates the relationship with North Korea. So Russia muscling into that relationship probably made Xi a little bit nervous. And then all this talk about this reverse Nixonian, right? That the strange Trump-Putin relationship is somehow about the Americans wanting to realign with Russia against China. So I think the Chinese are a little bit nervous about all this. Maybe high oil prices will make Putin a little bit overconfident. But in the end, I think the dominant partner here is China, right? And again, as I said before, I'm not sure necessarily we're in for a long period of higher oil price. We could end up being significantly lower ultimately because of all this stuff going on. So let's see how this pans out. It's not the Russia-China relationship is not made in heaven, right? Both are opportunistic, screw each other when they have an opportunity. China has definitely exploited Russian weakness by buying cheap energy from the Russians. But also China has massive strategic stockpile. There's been talk about the West releasing resources from a third of the West's special petroleum reserve. Well, actually, China's got the equivalent, probably about 1.2 billion barrels of oil in storage. So it has quite a lot of durability as well.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work. and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.